The moment my brother smiled and said our father left everything to him, I thought my entire family history had just been erased. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 32 years old, and until that morning, I believed I understood exactly who my brother Ryan was. We grew up in the same house outside Columbus, Ohio, sharing the same backyard, the same school district, the same quiet Midwestern life our dad built for us over 40 years. But the truth is, you don't really know someone until money, power, and inheritance enter the room. And that morning, sitting in a polished oak conference room across from a man in a gray suit, I watched my brother become someone I barely recognized. The lawyer's office was on the 12th floor of a downtown building overlooking the Scioto River. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, letting in the pale morning sunlight of an early October day. Everything about the room felt too clean, too quiet. A long wooden table divided us. My brother Ryan sat across from me, leaning back in his chair with the kind of relaxed confidence that didn't match the situation at all. Our father had passed away just 10 days earlier. The funeral was still fresh in everyone's minds. The flowers hadn't even finished wilting at the cemetery yet. But Ryan didn't look like a man grieving his father. He looked like a man who had already won something. Mr. Wallace, the estate lawyer, sat at the head of the table flipping slowly through a folder of documents. He was in his late 50s, with silver hair and thin rectangular glasses that gave him a calm, almost unreadable expression. I had met him only once before, years ago, when Dad first mentioned updating his estate plan. Back then it seemed like a routine adult responsibility. Now it felt like the center of everything. Ryan cleared his throat and leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table as if he were about to start a business meeting. "Well," he said with a casual shrug, "I guess we should just get this over with." The way he said it made my stomach tighten. Not sad. Not reflective. Just impatient. He glanced at me for half a second, then looked back toward the lawyer. Dad made it pretty clear what he wanted before he passed. That sentence landed in the room like a stone dropping into still water. I frowned slightly. Dad had never talked about the details with me. At least not directly. The only thing he ever said was that everything was taken care of and we shouldn't worry about it. Ryan reached into the leather briefcase beside his chair and pulled out a folded document. He smoothed it carefully against the table as if it were already official. "Actually," he continued, tapping the paper lightly with his finger, "he told me months ago how this was going to go." I felt a small spark of confusion in my chest. Months ago? Dad and I had spoken almost every week during the last year of his life. We talked about work, about the house, about the repairs he still wanted to finish before winter. But inheritance? The will? He never mentioned any changes. Ryan slid the document toward the center of the table so everyone could see it. His expression carried a faint, almost satisfied smile that made the moment feel strangely rehearsed. "Dad left the house to me," he said plainly. "And most of the estate." The words echoed quietly against the glass walls of the office. For a second, I thought maybe I had misunderstood him. The house? The same house we both grew up in. The two-story brick place on Maple Ridge Road with the wide front porch and the old oak tree in the yard. That house was the center of our entire childhood. Dad built the deck himself one summer when we were teenagers. I learned how to drive in the empty parking lot behind the grocery store 2 blocks away. Every Thanksgiving for 30 years had happened inside that kitchen. I blinked, trying to process what Ryan had just said. "Wait," I replied slowly. "You're saying Dad left everything to you?" Ryan lifted one shoulder casually. "Not everything," he corrected, though the tone of his voice suggested the difference barely mattered. "But most of it." Something about the way he said those words made the air feel heavier. Not apologetic. Not awkward. Just confident. Too confident. I glanced toward Mr. Wallace, expecting him to interrupt or clarify. But the lawyer simply watched quietly, his hands folded together in front of him as if he were studying a chessboard. That silence made my unease grow. Ryan leaned back again in his chair, stretching one arm across the backrest like someone settling in after closing a successful deal. "Look," he said, glancing at me again, "I know this might be a lot to hear all at once. But Dad and I talked about this for a while before he got sick. He wanted someone responsible handling things." Responsible. The word hung in the air between us. I felt a slow burn of disbelief rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. There had to be more to this conversation. There had to be something I was missing. "So what happens now?" I asked carefully. Ryan's smile widened just a little. "Now," he said. "Well, technically the house belongs to me once everything is finalized." He paused for a moment before adding something that made my stomach drop. "But don't worry. You can stay there for a while if you need to." The way he said it, like he was offering me a temporary favor, sent a chill through my entire body. I had lived in that house longer than Ryan had. I had helped Dad repair the roof 5 summers ago. I was the one who drove him to doctor's appointments during his last year. And suddenly my brother was talking like I was a guest. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, I noticed something strange. Mr. Wallace still hadn't said a word. He hadn't confirmed Ryan's claims. He hadn't even touched the document Ryan placed on the table. He was simply watching us with that same quiet, unreadable expression. And for reasons I couldn't explain yet, that silence felt more important than anything my brother had just said. Ryan folded his hands together on the table as if the conversation had already been decided long before I walked into that office. The confidence in his posture felt almost theatrical, like he had been rehearsing this moment in his head for weeks. He slid the document another inch closer toward me, the paper gliding across the polished surface of the table until it stopped directly in front of my seat. "You should take a look," he said calmly. "It explains everything." His voice carried the tone of someone who believed the discussion was already finished. I lowered my eyes to the paper. At the top of the page, in bold lettering, were the words "Last Will and Testament." Beneath it was my father's full legal name, Thomas Carter. Seeing his name written there created a strange heaviness in my chest. For a brief second I was not in that office anymore. I was standing in the garage of the old house on Maple Ridge Road watching him tighten a loose bolt on the lawn mower, the smell of gasoline and cut grass hanging in the air. Dad had always been practical. Organized. The kind of man who labeled every toolbox drawer and kept a handwritten list of repairs taped to the refrigerator. If he had truly changed his will, I knew he would have done it carefully. Deliberately. Nothing about him had ever been impulsive. I scanned the first few paragraphs of the document. The legal language stretched across the page in dense blocks of text. Most of it was the typical wording about estate distribution and executors. But then my eyes reached the section Ryan had clearly been waiting for. The property. The house. The majority of the estate assets. According to the paper in front of me, everything had been assigned to Ryan Carter. My brother watched my face carefully as I read, almost like he was waiting for a reaction he had already predicted. "Dad wanted stability," Ryan said after a moment, leaning back again in his chair. "You know how he was about that house. He did not want it getting tied up in complicated stuff." The way he spoke about it sounded less like an explanation and more like a prepared statement. I felt the edges of the paper between my fingers. The texture was smooth, freshly printed. Too fresh. "When was this signed?" I asked quietly without looking up yet. Ryan answered immediately, almost too quickly. "About 6 months ago." I raised my head. 6 months ago. He nodded casually. Right around the time Dad started having those health issues. He wanted to get everything handled while he still could. I tried to picture that timeline in my head. 6 months ago my father had still been driving himself to the hardware store every Saturday morning. We had spent an entire afternoon replacing a broken fence panel along the side yard together. Nothing about that time had felt like a man preparing a dramatic change to his estate. He never mentioned any of this to me, I said slowly. Ryan gave a small shrug that looked almost rehearsed. Well, Dan, you know how Dad was. He did not always feel like explaining every decision to everybody. His words were smooth, but something about them landed wrong. There was a subtle edge underneath them that made the room feel colder. I turned the page again, scanning the signature section. My father's name was there in dark ink at the bottom, followed by 2 witness signatures printed beneath it. At first glance it looked legitimate. The handwriting resembled his. The formatting appeared official. But a quiet feeling in the back of my mind refused to settle. Something about the entire situation felt strangely rushed. Ryan began talking again, filling the silence like someone narrating a victory. Look, I know this might be awkward, he continued. But realistically this is the cleanest way to handle things. The house stays in the family. I manage the assets. Everything stays simple. He paused for a moment, then added another sentence that made his position very clear. And honestly, Dad trusted me to handle that responsibility. Trusted me. The phrase echoed in my head. For most of our lives Ryan had always been the confident one, the louder one, the person who walked into every room like he owned it. But trust was never something Dad measured by personality. Dad believed in effort. In showing up when things needed to be fixed. In taking care of the people around you. That was the lesson he repeated every time something broke around the house. Ryan tapped the document lightly with his finger again. You can keep a copy of that if you want, he said. But Mr. Wallace already has everything he needs for the filing. That was when I noticed something else. The lawyer still had not touched the document. Mr. Wallace remained seated quietly at the head of the table, his hands resting calmly in front of him, his expression thoughtful but completely neutral. Ryan's entire explanation had unfolded without a single confirmation from the one person in the room who actually controlled the legal process. That detail began to grow louder in my mind with every passing second. Ryan must have sensed my hesitation because he leaned forward again slightly, lowering his voice as if he were offering reassurance. Look, Daniel, he said, using my full name now, I am not trying to push you out of anything. You can stay at the house for now. No rush. We will figure out what works best for everybody. The words sounded generous on the surface. But the meaning underneath them was unmistakable. According to him, the home we both grew up in was already his to control. I slowly set the document back on the table and looked again toward Mr. Wallace. The lawyer had been observing the entire exchange without interruption, his eyes moving calmly between Ryan and me as if he were measuring something far more important than the paper sitting in front of us. And for the first time since the meeting started, I noticed the slightest shift in his posture, the faint movement of his hand toward a separate folder resting beside him on the table. In that quiet moment, before anyone else spoke, a single thought passed through my mind. Ryan had spent the last 10 minutes explaining a document. But the only person in the room who truly understood my father's will had not said a single word yet. I kept staring at the document for a few seconds after setting it back down on the table, trying to understand why something about it refused to sit right in my mind. On the surface everything looked official. The language was formal. The signature resembled my father's handwriting. Even the witness lines appeared filled out correctly. But the longer I looked at it, the more a quiet tension began forming in my chest. My father had always been meticulous about paperwork. Growing up, I watched him organize every important document inside a locked filing cabinet in the hallway closet at the house on Maple Ridge Road. Insurance policies were placed in labeled folders. Property tax statements were clipped together by year. Even instruction manuals for appliances were neatly stacked in clear plastic sleeves. He treated documents with the kind of careful attention most people only give to fragile things. That was why the paper in front of me felt strangely unfamiliar. Ryan was still leaning back in his chair watching me with that same confident expression, as if he had already predicted exactly how this conversation would unfold. He crossed one ankle over the opposite knee and folded his arms casually. "Look, Dan," he said after a moment, his voice calm but firm. "I know this might feel sudden, but Dad and I talked about this a lot before he passed. He wanted to make sure everything stayed stable." I slowly lifted my eyes from the document and looked at him. "Stable?" I repeated quietly. Ryan nodded. "Yes. You know how he was about the house. He wanted someone managing it who could keep everything running smoothly." The words sounded reasonable on the surface, but they carried a subtle implication that made my stomach tighten again. It sounded less like an explanation and more like a justification that had already been rehearsed. I glanced again toward Mr. Wallace at the head of the table. The lawyer had finally opened the separate folder that rested beside him, though he still had not spoken. He was reading something quietly inside that folder, his expression steady and thoughtful. Ryan noticed the direction of my gaze and quickly continued speaking before the lawyer could say anything. "The property taxes, the maintenance, the land behind the house, all of that requires someone who can keep track of it long term," Ryan continued. Dad knew I had already been helping him with those things. That statement immediately triggered another memory in my mind. Over the past year, I had been the one driving Dad to the hardware store when he needed supplies. I was the one who spent 2 weekends repairing the loose boards on the back deck. Ryan visited occasionally, but most of the day-to-day responsibilities around the house had fallen to me. I did not say that out loud though. Instead I simply asked the one question that continued echoing in my mind. When exactly did Dad sign this? Ryan pointed to the date printed near the bottom of the page. April 12th. I studied the number for a moment. April 12th. That date immediately connected to something else in my memory. Around that time Dad had asked me to drive him to a medical appointment across town. I remembered the day clearly because it had been unusually warm for early spring, nearly 70 degrees outside, and we had stopped for lunch afterward at a small diner near the highway. I tried to picture the rest of that week. Dad had been tired from the appointment but otherwise normal. He talked about planting tomatoes in the garden behind the house. He mentioned replacing the old mailbox before summer. Nothing about his behavior. Suggested he had just rewritten the entire structure of his estate. Ryan leaned forward slightly, his tone growing more businesslike. "Look, the important thing is that the will is clear. Dad signed it. Witnesses signed it. Everything is already in order." I nodded slowly, though the feeling of unease inside me continued to grow stronger with every passing minute. Something about the situation felt rushed, almost like Ryan was trying to move the conversation forward before anyone else had time to question it. "So what happens with the rest of the estate?" I asked carefully. Ryan's answer came quickly. "The accounts will be transferred over the next few weeks. I will handle the property paperwork. The house will remain under my management." The phrase "my management" landed heavily in the room. It sounded less like a family arrangement and more like a corporate takeover. I noticed Ryan's fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the table, a small rhythmic motion that revealed just a hint of nervous energy beneath his calm appearance. He might have sounded confident, but something about his body language suggested he wanted this meeting to move quickly. That was when my eyes drifted back to the signature again. My father's handwriting had always been slightly slanted to the right with a long underline beneath his last name. The signature on this document looked similar, but the underline seemed shorter than I remembered. I leaned a little closer, studying the ink. The more I looked at it, the more another memory slowly surfaced in my mind. 3 weeks before Dad passed away, we had been sitting together at the kitchen table late one evening. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. He had been unusually thoughtful that night, staring out the window toward the backyard for several seconds before speaking. Then he said something that seemed random at the time. "Daniel," he said quietly, "sometimes people show you who they really are when they think nobody is watching." I had laughed softly back then, assuming he was talking about some small disagreement between neighbors or relatives. But now that sentence returned to my mind with a different weight. Ryan cleared his throat again, drawing my attention back to the room. "If you want to keep living at the house for a while, that is fine," he said. "We can figure out a timeline later." The word sounded polite, but the implication was clear. According to him, the home I had spent my entire life in was now something he could allow or deny. I felt my hands tighten slightly against the table, but before I could respond, something unexpected finally happened. Mr. Wallace slowly closed the folder he had been reading and placed both hands calmly on top of it. The quiet click of the folder closing echoed across the room. For the first time since the meeting began, the lawyer leaned forward slightly in his chair. And when he looked directly at Ryan, the expression on his face changed just enough for me to realize something important. Ryan had been explaining a document for the past 15 minutes. But the man responsible for my father's estate had not confirmed a single word of it. The moment Mr. Wallace leaned forward, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. The quiet confidence Ryan had been projecting for the last 15 minutes suddenly felt a little less solid. The lawyer rested his hands calmly on the closed folder in front of him and looked first at Ryan, then at me, as if carefully choosing the exact moment to speak. For a few seconds nobody said anything. The silence stretched across the polished table while the city skyline reflected faintly in the glass windows behind us. Ryan cleared his throat lightly, trying to maintain control of the conversation. "So I guess the next step is just filing the paperwork," he said, gesturing toward the document on the table as if the meeting had already reached its conclusion. Mr. Wallace did not respond immediately. Instead he reached out slowly and slid the paper Ryan had placed on the table a few inches closer to himself. He studied it for a moment with the same patient expression he had worn since the meeting began. Ryan's fingers started tapping again against the edge of the table, a subtle sign that his earlier confidence was beginning to thin. I watched the lawyer carefully, feeling a strange mix of tension and curiosity building inside my chest. For the first time since we sat down, Mr. Wallace finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, and measured. "Mr. Carter," he said, looking directly at Ryan, "before we continue, I would like to clarify something." Ryan nodded quickly. "Of course." The lawyer tapped the corner of the document lightly with one finger. "This document," he said slowly, "is the copy you brought with you today." Ryan nodded again. "Yes. That is the one Dad gave me." The lawyer lifted his eyes and studied Ryan for a brief moment before continuing. "I see." His tone remained polite, but there was a subtle weight behind those two words that made the room feel colder. Ryan shifted slightly in his chair. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Mr. Wallace leaned back a few inches, folding his hands together again. "Not necessarily a problem," he replied carefully. "But there are some details we should discuss before any conclusions are made." Ryan gave a small forced laugh. "Well, the document is pretty clear." He pointed toward the signature again. "Dad signed it. 2 witnesses signed it. Everything looks official." The lawyer nodded slightly as if acknowledging the point. "Yes, I see the signatures." He paused briefly, letting the words settle before adding something that immediately drew my attention. "However, estate documentation requires more than signatures alone." Ryan's tapping fingers stopped for the first time since the meeting started. I noticed the faint tightening of his jaw. "What do you mean?" Ryan asked. Mr. Wallace opened the folder in front of him again, sliding out a thin stack of neatly arranged papers. The movement was slow and deliberate, the kind of calm professionalism that comes from someone who has handled complicated situations many times before. He placed the papers gently on the table but did not reveal their contents yet. "When your father updated his estate planning," the lawyer continued, "he followed a very specific legal process." My heart began beating a little faster as I listened. Ryan leaned forward slightly. "Right," he said quickly. "That is exactly what this is." Mr. Wallace looked at the document Ryan had provided once more, then back at Ryan. Possibly, he replied. But we should review the official records before making that assumption. The word assumption lingered in the air like a quiet warning. Ryan shifted again in his chair, this time with less of the relaxed confidence he had earlier. Dad gave me that document personally, he insisted. He told me it was the updated will. The lawyer nodded politely. And I understand that is what you believe. The phrasing was subtle but unmistakable. What you believe. Not what is confirmed. I glanced down at the paper again, noticing the shorter underline in my father's signature that had bothered me earlier. The memory of that late-night conversation in the kitchen returned again with sharper clarity. Sometimes people show you who they really are when they think nobody is watching. Ryan looked toward me briefly, as if hoping I would support his explanation. When I said nothing, he turned back toward the lawyer. So what exactly are you saying? He asked, his voice slightly tighter now. Mr. Wallace folded his hands calmly again. I am saying that estate documents are only legally recognized when they are properly filed, recorded, and verified through the appropriate legal channels. Ryan frowned slightly. And this one is? The lawyer gave a small thoughtful nod. That is what we will confirm. The calm certainty in his tone made it clear that this conversation was far from finished. Ryan leaned back again, but this time the movement looked less relaxed and more defensive. His earlier confidence had begun to fade into something closer to impatience. Look, he said, Dad told me directly how everything was supposed to go. The house, the accounts, all of it. Mr. Wallace listened without interruption. Then he gently slid the papers from his folder forward across the table just far enough for both of us to see the official letterhead at the top. The Carter Estate Planning File. The sight of those words immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Ryan's eyes flickered briefly toward the folder before returning to the lawyer's face. What is that? He asked. Mr. Wallace's expression remained composed. These, he said calmly, are the documents your father finalized with my office during his most recent estate review. A quiet tension spread across the table as those words settled in. Ryan blinked once, clearly processing what the lawyer had just said. Most recent review, he repeated. Mr. Wallace nodded slowly. Yes. Then he added one sentence that caused my pulse to quicken. And according to our records, that meeting took place 3 weeks before your father passed away. Ryan's posture stiffened almost immediately. Because if the lawyer was telling the truth, then the document Ryan had been confidently presenting for the last 20 minutes suddenly raised a much bigger question. Ryan did not answer immediately after the lawyer finished speaking. The confidence that had carried him through the beginning of the meeting seemed to stall for a moment as he processed the words he had just heard. 3 weeks before our father passed away. The phrase hung in the air like a quiet thunderclap. Ryan leaned forward again slowly, his elbows resting on the table as he looked at the folder Mr. Wallace had placed in front of him. 3 weeks, he repeated, his voice tighter now. That does not make sense. Mr. Wallace did not react to the tension in Ryan's tone. Instead he calmly adjusted the stack of papers in front of him and continued speaking with the same measured clarity he had maintained since the beginning of the meeting. Your father contacted my office requesting a final review of his estate plan, the lawyer explained. He scheduled the meeting personally and arrived here with several specific instructions. I felt my attention sharpen immediately. Ryan frowned. That cannot be right, he said quickly. Dad already gave me the updated will months before that. Mr. Wallace folded his hands again. Your father did bring a document during that earlier discussion, he replied. However, he also expressed concerns about certain details that required revision. The word revision seemed to land heavily between us. Ryan shifted in his chair again. What kind of concerns? He asked. The lawyer glanced briefly at the document Ryan had placed on the table before answering. Concerns about clarity, verification, and long-term control of the estate. Ryan let out a quiet breath through his nose as if he were trying to remain patient. Well, that is exactly what this document handles, he said, tapping the paper again. It gives clear control of the property. Mr. Wallace's expression did not change. Yes, he said calmly. It does appear to do that. Then he paused for a moment before adding something that immediately caught my attention. But it does not reflect the instructions your father finalized during his last meeting here. Ryan's fingers stopped tapping entirely now. I could see the tension slowly building in his shoulders. What do you mean it does not reflect them? He asked. Mr. Wallace opened the folder fully and slid one of the papers out from the top of the stack. The page carried the official letterhead of his law office along with a printed date that immediately caught my eye. The date was recent. Very recent. Your father reviewed several documents during that final appointment, the lawyer continued. He asked questions about the protection of the house, the land behind it, and the financial accounts attached to the property. My heart began beating a little faster as I listened. Ryan leaned closer across the table, his earlier relaxed posture completely gone now. And what did he decide? Ryan asked. Mr. Wallace looked directly at him. He decided to make several changes. Ryan shook his head slightly as if dismissing the idea before it could fully settle in. No, he said. That is not possible. Dad told me exactly how the estate was structured. The lawyer remained calm. Your father did discuss the estate with both of you at different times, he said. But during that final meeting he wanted to ensure that his intentions could not be misunderstood. The word misunderstood carried a quiet weight that made the air feel heavier again. I leaned back slightly in my chair, listening carefully as the conversation unfolded. Ryan's jaw tightened. So you are saying the document I brought is wrong? He asked. Mr. Wallace did not answer immediately. Instead he lifted the paper Ryan had placed on the table earlier and examined it again carefully. The silence lasted just long enough to make Ryan visibly uncomfortable. Then the lawyer set the paper down again and spoke in the same steady tone. I am saying that this document does not match the final version your father executed through this office. Ryan blinked once as if trying to process what he had just heard. Executed, he repeated. Yes, Mr. Wallace said. Signed, witnessed, verified, and filed according to legal requirements. Ryan leaned back slightly again, but this time his posture looked far more rigid than confident. Dad told me that document was official, he insisted. He handed it to me himself. The lawyer nodded slowly. I understand that is your understanding of the situation. Ryan's eyes narrowed slightly. You keep saying that, he said. My understanding. Mr. Wallace gave a small thoughtful nod. Because the official record of your father's estate planning is maintained here. He gently tapped the folder in front of him. And those records indicate that your father finalized a different version. The words settled heavily across the table. Ryan stared at the folder for a moment before speaking again. So where is this other version? He asked. Mr. Wallace's hand moved calmly toward the bottom of the stack of papers. It is here, he said. The simple answer made Ryan's shoulders stiffen slightly. I could feel the tension rising in the room again as the lawyer carefully slid a sealed envelope from the folder. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and stamped with the official seal of the law office. Mr. Wallace placed it gently on the table between us. For a moment no one moved. Ryan stared at the envelope as if it had appeared out of nowhere. The confident expression he had carried into the room was gone now, replaced by something much more uncertain. What is that? Ryan asked quietly. Mr. Wallace looked directly at him. This, he said calmly, is the document your father asked us to secure after his final review. Ryan's eyes flickered briefly toward me and then back to the envelope. The room felt unusually quiet now, the distant sounds of traffic outside barely noticeable through the glass windows. And what exactly does it say? Ryan asked, his voice noticeably tighter than before. Mr. Wallace rested one hand lightly on top of the sealed envelope and answered with a level of calm that made the moment feel even heavier. It contains your father's final instructions regarding the distribution of his estate. Then he paused for a brief second before adding one final sentence that caused the tension in the room to spike again. And according to those instructions, the outcome may not be what you are expecting. Ryan stared at the sealed envelope as if the answer to everything in the room was locked inside it. The earlier confidence that had filled his voice when he first announced that our father left everything to him was now completely gone. In its place was something quieter and far less certain. For several seconds no one spoke. The envelope rested in the center of the table between us, its cream-colored surface catching the pale October sunlight coming through the tall windows behind the lawyer's desk. I could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic moving along the street 12 floors below. Ryan finally leaned forward again, his eyes fixed on the envelope. "If Dad had a final version," he said slowly, "why did he give me that document?" Mr. Wallace did not answer immediately. Instead he adjusted the position of the envelope slightly so it sat squarely in front of him. "Your father did bring a draft document to our earlier meeting," the lawyer said calmly. "But during the final review he made it very clear that certain changes were necessary." Ryan frowned. "Changes to what?" The lawyer looked directly at him. "To ensure that the estate could not be controlled or redirected in a way that contradicted his actual intentions." Ryan blinked once, clearly processing the words. "Controlled," he repeated. Mr. Wallace nodded slightly. "Your father was very careful about that point." I felt a subtle tension tightening in my chest again as I listened. Something about the lawyer's tone suggested that my father had anticipated this moment long before it happened. Ryan shifted in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "I still do not see how that changes anything," he said. "The will I brought clearly states how everything is distributed." Mr. Wallace glanced briefly at the document Ryan had presented earlier. "Yes," he said quietly. "It does state that." Then he rested his hand gently on top of the sealed envelope again. "But this document represents the final version your father personally confirmed with our office." Ryan leaned forward again immediately. "Then open it," he said. The words came out sharper than anything he had said so far. The lawyer did not react to the tension in Ryan's voice. Instead he calmly reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small silver letter opener. The movement was slow and deliberate, almost ceremonial. I watched carefully as he positioned the blade along the sealed edge of the envelope. For a brief moment the entire room felt suspended in silence. Ryan sat perfectly still now, his eyes locked on the envelope. The lawyer slid the letter opener across the seal with a clean, precise motion. The paper separated quietly as the envelope opened. Mr. Wallace reached inside and carefully removed a thick stack of documents. He placed them neatly on the table in front of him before setting the empty envelope aside. The top page was printed with the same bold heading I had seen earlier on Ryan's document. "Last Will and Testament." My pulse quickened as I read the name beneath it. Thomas Carter. My father. Ryan leaned forward. Across the table immediately. "That looks exactly the same," he said quickly. Mr. Wallace lifted one hand slightly. "Please allow me to read the relevant sections," he replied calmly. Ryan nodded once, though his jaw remained tight. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and began scanning the first page of the document. His eyes moved slowly across the text before he turned to the next page. The room remained completely silent while he reviewed the contents. I found myself studying Ryan's expression while we waited. The relaxed confidence he carried earlier had completely disappeared. His shoulders were stiff now, his posture tense, as if he were bracing himself for something he could not yet see. After another moment Mr. Wallace stopped turning pages. He looked up briefly at both of us before placing his finger gently on a specific paragraph. "Your father revised the distribution of several assets during this final version," he said. Ryan immediately leaned closer. What kind of revisions? The lawyer glanced back down at the document again. Primarily the residential property located on Maple Ridge Road and the land surrounding it. My heart began beating faster as I heard the address of our family home spoken out loud. Ryan spoke again quickly. Yes. That property goes to me. Mr. Wallace did not respond right away. Instead he carefully adjusted the page and began reading aloud in the same calm, steady tone he had used since the beginning of the meeting. I, Thomas Carter, being of sound mind and legal capacity, declare this to be my final will and testament. Upon my passing, the residential property located at 214 Maple Ridge Road, including all structures and adjoining land parcels, shall be transferred to. He paused for a moment. Just long enough for the silence in the room to feel almost unbearable. Ryan leaned even closer across the table. Transferred to who? He asked. Mr. Wallace lifted his eyes slowly from the document and looked directly at him. And in that moment I realized something important. Ryan had spent the entire meeting assuming he already knew the answer. But the lawyer had not confirmed it even once. Mr. Wallace returned his attention to the document and continued reading the sentence that Ryan had been so certain about from the beginning. And the name he spoke next changed the entire direction of the conversation. Daniel Carter, Mr. Wallace said clearly. His voice steady as he finished the sentence. For a moment I thought I had misheard him. The name seemed to echo strangely in my head, like a sound bouncing around a quiet room. Ryan did not move at first. He simply stared at the lawyer as if waiting for the rest of the sentence to correct itself. But the lawyer calmly lowered the page back onto the table and looked directly at both of us. The residential property located at 214 Maple Ridge Road, including the house and the surrounding land parcels, shall be transferred to Daniel Carter. The room became so quiet that I could hear the faint ticking of the clock mounted on the far wall. Ryan blinked once, then leaned forward sharply. No, he said immediately. That is not right. Mr. Wallace did not react to the interruption. Instead he calmly turned the document slightly so both of us could see the paragraph printed on the page. The words were unmistakable. My name was written there in full legal text, exactly where Ryan had expected to see his own. Ryan pushed his chair back a few inches with a sudden movement. That has to be a mistake, he said. The document I brought clearly states that the house goes to me. Mr. Wallace folded his hands calmly again. Yes, I saw the document you provided, he said. However, that document does not match the final version your father signed and filed through this office. Ryan shook his head slowly, almost as if he were trying to physically reject what he had just heard. Dad told me personally that I was taking over the house, he insisted. He gave me the paper himself. Mr. Wallace nodded once. Your father did provide you with a draft during an earlier discussion, he said carefully. But he later expressed concerns that the draft did not fully protect the intentions he wanted carried out. Ryan frowned deeply. Protect them from what? The lawyer paused briefly before answering. From potential misunderstandings or manipulation of incomplete documents. The word manipulation seemed to land heavily in the room. Ryan's eyes flickered toward me for a split second before returning to the lawyer. So you are saying this new version just appeared 3 weeks before he died? Ryan asked. Mr. Wallace calmly slid another page from the stack and placed it beside the paragraph he had just read. Your father met with me personally in this office during that final review, he explained. 2 witnesses were present. The document was signed, verified, and filed immediately afterward. Ryan leaned closer across the table again, his voice tighter now. And you are sure about that? Mr. Wallace adjusted his glasses slightly. Absolutely. The filing was completed at 3:24 in the afternoon on the same day. The precision of the time seemed to hit Ryan harder than anything else. He leaned back in his chair again, running one hand across his forehead as if trying to reorganize the entire situation in his mind. I could feel my own pulse beating in my ears as I stared down at the page. The words did not feel real yet. The house on Maple Ridge Road. The place where we had grown up. The place where my father built almost every memory we had as a family. According to the document in front of me, he had left it to me. Ryan suddenly leaned forward again, pointing toward the page. Even if that part changed, he said quickly, that does not mean the rest of the estate changed. Mr. Wallace looked down at the document again. Actually, he replied calmly, several sections were revised. Ryan's expression tightened further. What sections? The lawyer turned to another page and placed his finger along the next paragraph. The financial accounts connected to the property were reassigned, he said. And the responsibility for managing the land maintenance and property taxes was also transferred to Daniel Carter. Ryan's jaw visibly clenched now. So what exactly am I receiving? He asked. Mr. Wallace scanned the document again before answering. Your father allocated a financial distribution equal to 20% of the estate's liquid assets. Ryan stared at him in disbelief. 20%, he repeated. Yes, the lawyer said calmly. That amount will be transferred once the estate review process is completed. Ryan leaned back again, his chair shifting slightly across the polished floor. For the first time since the meeting began, he looked completely unsure of himself. The confident tone he had used earlier was gone entirely now. That cannot be what he wanted, Ryan said quietly. Mr. Wallace studied him for a moment before replying. Your father was very clear about his intentions. Ryan shook his head again. No. This does not make sense. The lawyer slowly lifted the final page of the document and turned it toward us. Your father anticipated that this moment might raise questions, he said. Ryan frowned. What do you mean? Mr. Wallace tapped the bottom of the final page gently. Because he left an additional note explaining his decision. Ryan leaned forward again slowly. A note? Mr. Wallace nodded. Yes. A personal statement attached to the will. Ryan's voice dropped slightly as he asked the next question. And what does it say? The lawyer glanced down at the handwritten page attached to the document, then looked back at Ryan. Your father asked that this message be read aloud if there was any confusion about his final decision. Ryan swallowed once. Then read it. Mr. Wallace lifted the page carefully from the stack and began unfolding it. And as the paper opened, I realized that whatever my father had written there was about to explain everything that had just happened in this room. Mr. Wallace unfolded the handwritten page carefully, smoothing it flat against the table before adjusting his glasses again. The paper looked different from the typed legal documents beneath it. The ink was darker, the lines slightly uneven, unmistakably written by hand. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was my father's. The same slanted letters I had seen on grocery lists taped to the refrigerator for decades. The same deliberate strokes he used when signing birthday cards or labeling tools in the garage. For a moment the lawyer simply looked down at the page as if making sure he understood every word before reading it aloud. Ryan leaned forward across the table, his elbows pressed against the polished wood surface, his eyes locked on the paper like he was trying to read it from across the room. Go ahead, Ryan said quietly. Read it. Mr. Wallace nodded once and began speaking in a calm, steady voice. This note was written by Thomas Carter and attached to the final version of his will during the last estate review meeting. He paused briefly before continuing. The statement reads as follows. The lawyer lowered his eyes to the page again. To my sons, Daniel and Ryan. If you are hearing this message, it means the lawyer has already explained how the estate is being divided. I want both of you to understand that this decision was not made quickly. I spent many months thinking about what should happen to the house and the land around it. That property is not just a financial asset. It represents the life our family built together. I felt a quiet weight settle in my chest as I listened. The room around me faded slightly as the lawyer continued reading my father's words. Daniel has spent years helping maintain the house, repairing what breaks, and keeping the property running the way it should. I trust him to protect the home that has meant so much to our family. Ryan shifted slightly in his chair but did not interrupt. Mr. Wallace continued reading. Ryan, if you are hearing this, I want you to know that I did not make this decision to punish you. But I became aware that an earlier draft of my will was being presented as if it were the final version. That draft was never meant to replace the official document filed through my attorney. Ryan's eyes widened slightly at those words. Mr. Wallace continued reading without changing his calm tone. The reason I scheduled the final meeting with my lawyer was to make sure there would be no confusion about my intentions. The official will on record is the only version that represents my final decision. Ryan shifted again in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table now. The lawyer turned the page slightly and continued reading. Money has a way of testing people. I have seen families fall apart because of inheritance disputes. I wanted to make sure that would not happen here. The room remained completely silent except for the sound of the lawyer's voice. Daniel has always shown patience and responsibility when it comes to the house. That is why the property belongs to him now. I could feel my heart beating steadily as I listened. My father's voice almost echoed through the words on the page. The calm certainty of someone who had already thought through every consequence. Mr. Wallace continued reading the final lines of the message. Ryan, you will still receive a portion of the estate because you are my son and I care about your future. But the house and land must remain with the person who will protect them. Ryan finally spoke, his voice tight. That is not what he told me. Mr. Wallace lowered the page slightly but did not respond yet. Ryan leaned forward again, frustration rising in his tone. He told me months ago that the house would be mine. He gave me that document himself. The lawyer folded the handwritten note carefully and placed it beside the will before answering. Your father explained that situation during the final meeting, he said calmly. Ryan frowned. What situation? Mr. Wallace looked directly at him. He explained that the earlier document you received was a preliminary draft. It was never filed or executed through this office. Ryan shook his head slowly. That is not possible. The lawyer rested one hand on the stack of papers again. Your father was concerned that the draft might eventually be presented as if it were final. That is why he insisted on attaching the handwritten clarification. Ryan stared at the documents on the table as if they had suddenly become something unfamiliar. The confident posture he carried into the room earlier was completely gone now. I remained quiet, still absorbing the words my father had written. The explanation was simple, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. Mr. Wallace gently slid the final will back into the envelope along with the handwritten note. Your father took every step necessary to ensure his intentions were legally protected, he said. Ryan leaned back slowly in his chair, his eyes still fixed on the envelope. So that is it, he asked quietly. Mr. Wallace nodded once. Yes. That is it. Ryan did not say anything for several seconds. The silence in the room felt heavier now, not because of tension but because the truth had finally been laid out clearly in front of all of us. The house on Maple Ridge Road, the place where our entire childhood existed, had never truly been Ryan's to claim in the first place. Ryan remained completely silent for a long time after the lawyer finished speaking. The energy in the room had changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. When the meeting began, Ryan had walked in with the confidence of someone who believed the entire outcome was already decided. Now he sat back in his chair staring at the sealed envelope on the table like it had just erased the version of reality he had been expecting all morning. The city skyline outside the tall windows looked the same as before, but inside that conference room everything felt different. Mr. Wallace carefully organized the documents back into the envelope with the same quiet precision he had shown throughout the entire meeting. When he finished, he placed the envelope back into the folder and closed it gently. Ryan finally spoke again, though his voice was noticeably lower than it had been at the start. "So that is the final decision," he said slowly. Mr. Wallace nodded once. "Yes. Your father completed every legal step required to make sure the estate would be handled exactly as he intended." Ryan looked down at the table for a few seconds before lifting his eyes again. "And there is nothing that changes that?" The lawyer remained calm. "No. The final will that was filed 3 weeks before your father passed away is the controlling document." Ryan leaned back slightly in his chair again, exhaling through his nose as if the weight of the situation had finally settled in. The earlier document he had placed on the table was still lying near his hand, the same paper he had confidently presented as proof that the house belonged to him. Now it looked smaller somehow, like a piece of paper that had already lost the argument. He reached out and slowly folded it in half before sliding it back toward his briefcase. For the first time since we walked into the room, Ryan looked directly at me without the confident edge he had carried earlier. There was no anger in his expression. Just something quieter, almost reflective. "Dad really thought you should have the house," he said. I did not answer immediately. My eyes drifted toward the window for a moment, watching the sunlight reflect off the glass buildings across the street. The house on Maple Ridge Road suddenly felt closer in my mind than the office we were sitting in. I could picture the long driveway, the wooden porch railing my father rebuilt 2 summers ago, the tall oak tree that dropped leaves across the front yard every October. That place had never been about ownership. It had always been about the life that happened inside it. I turned back toward the table. "He wanted someone to take care of it," I said quietly. Ryan nodded once, slowly. "Yeah," he said. "That sounds like him." Mr. Wallace stood up from his chair and closed the folder containing the will. "The estate process will continue over the next several weeks," he explained. "The property transfer documents will be prepared, and both of you will receive copies for your records." Ryan nodded absent-mindedly, though it was clear his mind was still processing everything that had just happened. The lawyer gathered the remaining papers on the table and placed them neatly into his briefcase. Then he looked at both of us. "Your father was very deliberate about the choices he made," he said. "He wanted clarity, not conflict." The room fell quiet again after that. Ryan finally stood up, adjusting his jacket as he did. For a moment he looked around the conference room as if trying to place the entire conversation back into some kind of order. Then he picked up his briefcase and turned toward the door. Before leaving, he paused and looked back at me one last time. "Take care of the place," he said simply. He cared about that house more than anything. I nodded. "I know." Ryan gave a small, almost tired smile before opening the door and stepping out into the hallway. The door closed quietly behind him. For a few seconds I remained seated at the table, staring at the folder that contained my father's final words. Mr. Wallace walked toward the window and looked out across the city skyline before speaking again. "Your father believed that home should stay with the person who understood what it meant," he said. I nodded slowly. In that moment I realized something that had been hidden beneath the tension of the entire meeting. The real inheritance had never been about money or documents or signatures. It was about responsibility. My father had spent his entire life building something that lasted longer than any argument over property. And now that responsibility had quietly passed to me. When I finally stood up and walked toward the door, the image of the house on Maple Ridge Road stayed clear in my mind. The wide porch. The old oak tree. The long gravel driveway stretching toward the road. It was still the same place it had always been. The only difference now was that my father had trusted me to protect it.